Welcome back to Elementary Statistics. We are in part 14 and we're going to be looking at some practice examples. And this is for the homeschooled students that I tutor from time to time. So if you're just looking at this series to get kind of information, you can skip to the next video. The examples are related to some of the homework that's assigned. So in this case, we're going to be looking at just to review some examples of the data tendency, the spread of data, and then spotting incredible values or outliers if they exist. In a lot of data sets, there may not be outliers. And so in these examples, let's consider what is the tendency, how many values around the tendency can be spread. I think one of the first examples we'll be looking at, we can kind of think about how that tendency could be spread, and then what could the unusual values be if any unusual values exist. And then if any exist, what would be the outliers, the really unusual values? So in one of the practice examples, since I highlighted Mish talk in one of the other videos, I'm going to highlight another example of a post that he wrote that I thought was really good, which is about on the very far, I think it's right side of your screen, yes, you can see there is an inflation calculator that he uses when he talks about the price of food that is rising or falling. And one of the things that he points out at the very top of that image is that the cost of chicken has gone up relative to what you would expect with inflation. I think it's about 2.5% a year. And that's since, I think he calculates since the 80s. In the 70s, for the record, there was higher inflation. So if we were looking just at inflation in general, we would say that the 70s was a you would have higher values. And then if you look at the total data together, you might say that there may have been periods in maybe the early 80s, but the 70s that would be unusual values for inflation. Again, if you were looking at the last 40 to 50 years, those might be unusual patterns. I wouldn't say that any of the values are outliers. Now, Brazil saw values of like 100,000% inflation. That would be an outlier if you look at it overall, but at least in the United States, we had more unusual values. So since inflation is bad, we'll say it's on the left side of the bell curve. It would have been closer to the far right, or sorry, far left tail. But generally speaking, what we would expect is we would expect that most of the inflation values would probably be within the 2 to 4% range. That would be normal, and then you would have like really low inflation or high inflation. Well, then he points out that college education, on the other hand, has been growing at over 7% a year. And so one of the things that I point out, well, but what we know about the millennials when we study millennials is that more millennials go to college than baby boomers went to college. And so if you look at the percent of baby boomers that went to college, and you look at that on the bell curve, in fact, we'll go to the next slide really fast. We'll look at this. That green arrow that you see, if we were describing the population and we were to say that going to college is the right side of the bell curve, we would say that, and it depends on how you look at it, but fewer baby boomers went to college as a population than millennials, whereas millennials are the red arrow, right? So there was more of them that went to college. So what happened is that millennials, it became the tendency to go to college, or closer to the tendency to go to college. And there's only so many jobs where you may need a college degree, or only so many jobs where a college degree may be useful. And some jobs it may not be that useful. And so what happened is, as that became the tendency, first of all, the wages may have gone down, but remember that it becomes a tendency because, I mean, when it becomes a tendency, there's going to be more demand, right? Well, as you have an increase in demand, what ends up happening? Well, the price is going to rise. It's basic economics. So college degrees are the tendency for millennials, while college degrees were the exception, or I should say, not really an exception, but they were rare for baby boomers. It wasn't as common for a baby boomer to have a college degree as you see with millennials, and that has impacted prices. So that kind of explains why, at least in my opinion, that explains why you see education outpacing some of the other things in terms of inflation, is it really goes back to the parents and they're demanding it. In the case of medicine, the reason why it's outpacing in terms of inflation is because you have a labor shortage in medicine, but that's a different topic. And so again, we can go back to this article, like this would be, maybe this would be an outlier for, well, you know, for a 22-year-old. I think he is 22 years old, but in this article, but this might be an outlier for someone who's 22, because the median individual income in the United States is around 30,000. But that is not somebody who's in their 20s. That's going to be probably somebody closer to their 30s. So for a 22-year-old, this is probably an outlier value. So this would be kind of an exception. But if everybody went out to become welders, it's important to note that they wouldn't pay that much, right? This is not a standard value if everybody was doing this. a part of what's allowed him to do this is the fact that there are other people that were predominantly going to school or doing other things, and so welding became kind of the exception or an unusual career path. And he was young and got in early. By the way, I think both of his parents have PhDs, and they were the ones that encouraged him to go to pursue welding because it was rare. So here's maybe, we'll say, just to be safe, we'll say that this one is an outlier. So here's the outlier in this data set when we look at it. If we were looking at it as a population of education, right, well, we would say more educated is on the right tail. I'm not insulting people who are uneducated, by the way, but we're looking at it if the right tail is educated and the left tail is uneducated. Well, let's say that this was, in this case, I think he has his associates, but let's suppose he didn't and he was just a welder in general. He may be on the left tail, but he's still doing on the income scale. He's going to be more on the right tail of the income scale in terms of his age group. And yes, I think he has an associate's degree. So to be fair, he would still be considered educated. He's just educated with a blue collar skill. Another example of this, you can see this in social media. Social media is a great example of getting the tendency of data. So in this one, just in case you can't see it, in the top image, you have a mother telling her son, if you don't study, you're going to end up being basically a trash person. And in the bottom image, you have a mother telling her daughter, the reason why you study is to make his world better. And yes, I recognize that both viewpoints are putting down the trash person, even though that's an important job. I get that. But as you see, it gets over 3,000 retweets, almost 7,000 favorites. And if we think about it in terms of social media, you're grabbing a big chunk of that population, a big chunk of the population. The reason why this is a popular tweet is because a big chunk of people think that, knowing what we know about the millennials being educated and education becoming the tendency, this image resonates with millennials, right? Because it's, kind of putting down people who aren't educated and putting up people who are educated. And so there's the popularity. The deep message being, you go to school to make everybody else's world better. But it's good. And social media, by the way, provides a lot of great examples of if you want to look at the tendency. And one of my homework assignments for students will be involving social media because it's just phenomenal. And then one of the funny ones that I like is tattoos. And so tattoos used to be kind of a rebellious thing before my time, but it was rare for a person to have a tattoo. You can ask your parents if you don't believe me. Assuming your parents were like in their 60s or 70s or 80s, but your parents will tell you that it was very rare for people to have a tattoo. Well, in the millennial generation, I've seen various studies, but in terms of millennials who either have a tattoo currently or had a tattoo, so there are tattoo removals. But if you look at millennials who either have a tattoo or had a tattoo, you get anywhere from 45 to 55% of millennials have or had tattoos, right? Well, think about that for a second. That's becoming the tendency, right? Like, in fact, I was recently doing something where I was trying to think of anybody that I was around, and there was about 20 to 30 of us, and I think every single one of them had tattoos. And it hit me in like the last day. I was like, this really has become the tendency. Like when you are around people in the age range of like 18 to 30, I mean, it's crazy, but it's like, you don't really meet that many people without tattoos. Now, granted, it is, depends on what you're doing. If I went to, let's say, the Mormon church or something, or maybe if I went and hung out with some Amish people, there'd be nobody with tattoos. But it has become the tendency. And so this is kind of funny because at one time, you would be considered an unusual data point if you had tattoos. Now, you wouldn't be an outlier, but you would definitely be one of the more unusual data points. And now, in order to be the unusual data point with a tattoo, you need to have like, kind of be like that Buck Cherry album or whatever, where the tattoos are just covering all your entire body. And that's how you would, do tattoos. Or maybe a couple of tattoo sleeves. I think those are still considered pretty rare. But it is actually very normal to have one or have had a tattoo. And so that's becoming the tendency. And so this is just kind of some examples of how we can look at data and kind of apply what we've learned. And you could see the spread. Like, for instance, in the case of college, we could think about, a person having some college, let's say an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree, a master's, a PhD, a professional, etc. Like, we could spread it out further, and we can go into details in each of these, and we can see how the data look. Or in the case of social media, we can use the tendency, and we can determine things from that, right? We can kind of see the perception that people have about things. And so that's very useful in social media. It's a great way of tracking sentiment. Generally speaking, if you ever test it, let's say you have a couple of popular accounts or a couple of accounts that may not be super popular, but if you tweet something that, let's say, confirms what a lot of people like to believe or they believe, you'll generally find you can get anywhere from about 500 to 1,000 retweets very easily. But then if you, let's say, tweet something that doesn't get a lot of views, it's not going to be shared, etc. So it's very interesting how you can kind of test all of these things, and you can see what the tendency is in a population.